Hey everybody, Marshall here to share some really cool news with you. I trust at this point you've all heard about Kvik yeast. This is that Norwegian ale strain that can ferment cleanly at temperatures as high as, no joke, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 38 degrees Celsius. Absolutely crazy stuff. Well, last year, Imperial Yeast dropped A43 Loki, their Kvik strain, as a seasonal release, which meant we all had a pretty small window to get our hands on some. Not anymore. Imperial Yeast recently announced they're making A43 Loki a year-round strain due to popular demand. They're excited about it. I'm super excited about it. I've had some amazing beers fermented with Loki at terrifyingly warm temperatures. It is amazing stuff. Go grab some A43 Loki and see what all the fuss is about for yourself. Oxygen and beer do not mix, or more accurately, they shouldn't mix, but unfortunately often do. For a chemical element that's necessary to the existence of so many living organisms, it's astonishing the havoc oxygen can wreak on beer, turning a malty Helles into a stale mess or a hop-juicy IPA into an insipid dumper in a matter of days. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me to talk with you about methods for avoiding, or at the very least, reducing cold-side oxidation is my friend and contributor, Brian Hall.
Hey, Marshall. It's great to be back on the show. It's been a while, and I am more than thrilled to be talking to you about low-oxygen fermentation and packaging.
Something you're passionate about. I know that. With the styles of beer that you prefer, this is something that's kind of a big deal for you.
Yeah, it's something that goes without saying, the New England IPA movement kind of opened my eyes to how quickly oxygen can affect beers on the cold side, and I've started taking a lot of those thoughts and pushing them towards other beers that I brew. And anecdotally, I think that there is some improvement from some of those beers and how long they are shelf stable.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I think a lot of people can relate with me on this, but it took me a minute to really grasp just how serious the impact of oxygen on the cold side. And by cold side, we're talking about post-fermentation, if that's confusing to anyone. Just how detrimental it can be to beer. And, in my experience, I'm making these beers as I'm getting into brewing and whatnot, and they're coming out drinkable. And for me, that was, I guess at first that was good enough. And then I move into kegging and all of this, and I'm using methods that aren't very, I guess, oxygen reducing, if you will. And it wasn't really until, the beers, again, they're turning out fine, but it wasn't until I started making or dabbling around in making really hoppy beers, and especially hazy New England IPA, where the impact of oxygen really became evident.
Right, and I think that's apparent in a lot of the other styles, but I think it's a lot faster of a reaction that happens in a New England IPA. I've noticed that beers over time tend to really change flavor in my house, or they did for a long period of time. And as I've kind of gotten better the last several years as having, I don't know what you want to call it, cold side low-dough techniques.
Tighter methods. We'll just stick with tighter methods. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, tighter methods on the cold side. I haven't noticed as much of a fluctuation in flavor over months of having the same beer on tap, assuming that it makes it that long.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you certainly are not alone in that. It's kind of funny because, if we're being honest, the hazy IPA thing, as much love as it gets in the craft beer world overall, there's a contingent of people who just aren't a big fan of the style because of the way it looks, is what I'm presuming. But at the very least, what we can say is that style, I think, has really spurred some thought and really digging into what it is behind cold-side oxidation, because of the fact it just seems so sensitive to oxygen. Reducing that cold-side oxidation, that's the topic of this show. But before we get to the goods, I just want to tell everybody about some cool changes coming to the Brewlosophy Podcast. As regular listeners are aware, our primary focus has been on the experiments that we've performed, which is great. We are definitely not running out of content or anything like that. But over the last month or so, the crew started talking talking about things that we might be able to do to make the show just a little bit better, more fun to listen to. And inspired by all the great feedback on our non-experiment based shows that we've done, we've decided to introduce a few new series that are, they're going to be interspersed between our normal experiment episodes. So here's what we're planning on, some of which are going to sound really familiar. First off is our exBEERience series, which is what this episode is. And yes, I'm going to stick with the cheesy naming convention on this thing, but I know it's lame. But these episodes are going to be focused on a specific topic without getting too much into the sciencey experiment findings. We might reference them because I do think that that's inspired a lot of our approaches to the way that we brew. But we're going to be sharing the main point's going to be that we're going to be sharing our general experiences with whatever it is that we're talking about. Again, like this show, we're going to be talking about ways that we go about reducing cold-side oxidation. Next, and one that we've already done a few times, is our short and shoddy series, the main point of which is to kind of dive deep into specific beer styles while also talking about our experience brewing them using abbreviated and arguably non-traditional methods. The response to past short and shoddy episodes that we've done has been very positive, so we're going to make it a regular thing. That's all that is. Now, we've got a few more ideas. We're just not quite as set on them yet, so please let us know what you think. Those of you who've been following brewlosophy.com for a few years may recall a relatively short-lived series that we did called Brews Views. This was where we would share our opinions on a specific, I guess you could argue, maybe not contentious topic, but something that maybe isn't necessarily talked about widely in brewing. But anyways, we're thinking about bringing this back to life in audible form, which I think would probably work better than written form. Basically, I have a couple contributors openly discuss this topic on the show. Our idea at this point is to keep these shows as genuine as possible, meaning they could get a bit more raw than usual. Topic ideas include things like being a parent who brews, the rise of hazy IPA, this very contentious IPA style, and big beers creep into craft beer and home brewing, stuff like that. Another idea that we've had is to start a series on the Hop Chronicles, which seems natural since that's a common thing that we do, or a regular thing that we do over at the website. That's our monthly hop-focused project where we share data collected from blind tasters on a beer hopped with a single variety. Paul Amico, whose voice you heard on our Kicking Kegs episode, and who is now the kind of heading up the whole Hop Chronicles project for the website, would likely be my regular co-host. He does live near me in Fresno, so he'd be live in the studio, which would be a lot of fun. We're just that one I think is a shoo-in. We're going to do it. We just got to figure out how to organize it, and so we can talk about a single hop variety for an hour. But again, let us know what you think about this, or if you have any other ideas for series that we might be able to do. We're always open to feedback. All right. If you enjoy this show and would like to make sure it sticks around for a while, there are a few things that you can do to help, like becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month is Experimental Brewing's Drew Beecham, who's a fun dude who's authored books on cider and brewing, including his latest with Denny Kahn called Simple Homebrewing. Great beer, less work, more fun, which you can pick up now at Amazon.com and all your other fine book retailers. Past guests have included folks like Scott Janish, Gordon Strong, and Stan Hieronymus, to name a few. All past sessions are available on our private Facebook page for patrons to watch whenever they want to. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy, and a huge cheers to all of those who are already patrons of Brewlosophy. If you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who's already done that for us as well. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers killer stainless gear such as the turnkey BH15 pilot brewing system, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware also has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and home brewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Chad Armstrong wrote in with feedback on a comment made on our last Brew&A episode. Here's what he said. Someone mentioned using the blow-off of CO2 created during fermentation to purge a keg filled with star sand. I thought that sounded like a great idea, so I rigged up the blow-off tube to a keg after the ferment was going strong, about 24 hours in or so. The keg was emptied in less than 12 hours and full of CO2. I was a little concerned about doing this in a glass carboy, as I wasn't sure how much pressure would be on the fermenter as it pushed out the star sand, but it worked fine. I'm planning on transferring into that keg via gravity with the purged CO2 going back into the fermenter as the keg fills with beer. Well, timely feedback, Chad, as we'll be digging into this topic pretty deeply when we're talking about reducing cold-side oxidation later in the show. Suffice to say, I've tried this as well using the new Spike Brewing Flex Plus fermenter, which it has a ton of crazy features on it. But it did work. Like it sounds like it worked great for you. It worked incredibly well for me as well, to the point I can't believe it took me so long to try it out. Brian, is this something you've messed around with at all?
No, I believe in free-range carbon dioxide, so I just let mine go into the air and back into its natural state.
So you are responsible for the melting ice caps, Brian. That's...
Whoa. Actually, anything to melt down those ice caps and bring a little more heat up north sounds good to me.
You are going to get us murdered, my friend.
Yeah, I'm going to hell. But seriously, no, it's not something I've done. I have tried, we're going to talk about these a little bit later, but I've tried other techniques as far as, having carbon dioxide available to go back in during a cooling fermenter, which I think is kind of the ultimate goal of pushing it out.
Yeah.
I do push CO2 out of kegs for transferring it later, but I haven't connected mine. I'm currently using brew buckets, and once they're in the fridge, there isn't a lot of room when I have all my experiments in there to do an extra keg for each one. So.
Yeah. That's the one big drawback for me as well, is that if I'm using this technique and I don't feel like punching holes in my fermentation chamber, that I have to, it's one batch, because I've got basically 2 kegs in there along with my fermentation vessel. And, so it is what it is. But Chad, we are going to get into this a lot deeper a bit later, but thank you for the feedback. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com. Leave us a voice message by calling 951-444-0320 or drop us a line on social media. I consider myself really fortunate to live so close to Firestone Walker Brewing Company, which I honestly think is one of the best breweries out there. It's about a couple hours away from Fresno, so I get fresh 12 packs all the time. In fact, I just picked up another one this weekend. Well, a few months ago, I noticed a new beer in the mix pack called St. Lucia IPA, which they describe, and I quote this, as a next generation unfiltered West Coast IPA inspired by our flagship Union Jack IPA, but with its own unique blend of Cashmere, Azacca, Amarillo, Hallertau Blanc, and Eldorado hops. The result is a fresh twist on a familiar favorite, combining a bold malt foundation with a progressive hop profile. Well, I had some on hand, so I shared it with my buddies.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Come on, Jersey, wake up. This is very clear.
It's a Scientology beer. I'm going
We
clear.
got a lager here.
Do you like it? Do you like it?
Yeah,
Do you like it?
not so much. I was fooled with the clarity of it.
Yeah. Weird.
It's not a lager.
This beer was crafted by Xenu.
They must have used the gelatin in
Oh, the gelatin finder, you learned man, you.
Let me take another sip.
You become a billboard.
I guess my first sip of the IPAs.
Oh, this is every
are
time
pale
you're
ale.
like, my God, it tastes like garbage. And the next sip, you're like, this is delicious.
It's not. I didn't say delicious.
No, here's the problem is that you have no idea what you're doing.
That is the problem.
All right, let me take care of this. It actually looks like it could be a Millikers. Let's take a sippy sip. I like it. Oh, it's
Really?
good. Oh,
It's
I know this type. It's one of those types that Marshall's given us before.
Actually, I don't mind it. It's very hoppy though, and it's lingering
so
afterwards.
Good. I feel like he should have this sign up on the wall with all the types, and we can just pick
and we
one.
can throw a dart at it.
I don't know the type, but this is maybe it's not good, but it's right in my wheelhouse. This is my kind of beer, bro. Judge me.
It's not my wheelhouse, that's for sure.
You don't have a wheelhouse. Ouch. Don't kick me on the air. I love this beer.
It's just hanging on too long.
I don't know what it is, but I do. I love it. I really like it a lot. There's above 10 jerseys, and it's called This is Fucking Delicious, and this one's in there. This one's fucking delicious. This gets this one's fucking delicious from Jersey.
I can say I've had worse.
Like it because I like it.
No, I'm not, that's not me.
It's not your thing.
No, I'll go 5.
A total of
45.
I wasn't surprised Tim didn't like this beer, and it wasn't shocking that Jersey did. We actually drank quite a bit of Union Jack usually, and Tim Tim and Jersey both have Keezers at their house that I helped them to build. Almost always Jersey has Union Jack on tap, so I already knew that he liked the base of St. Lucia. Something about that hop blend, I don't want to sound like I'm embellishing things too much. It's freaking amazing. Brian, have you had the opportunity to try this beer yet?
I have not had that beer.
Do you guys get fresh Firestone Walker up there in Anchorage?
We don't get fresh anything in Anchorage. We do get some Firestone Walker. I've seen the Luponic Distortion on the shelves and a couple other ones. I really don't buy a whole lot of commercial IPA, especially because by the time it gets up here, it's a month or two old. But I'm glad to hear that something had Azacca in its hop profile. It tasted good.
Yeah, not only did it taste good, it tasted amazing. I told you I got this the 12-pack was it Saturday, and I had to go and grab a Union Jack, which is what I'm drinking now because the St. Lucia is all gone. So if you have the opportunity to try St. Lucia IPA, I couldn't recommend it more. I'm with Jersey. It's absolutely delicious, and Tim's going to keep drinking it because he's okay with it. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. All right, reducing cold-side oxidation is the name of the game when we're back from this break. So I've been hanging out with brewers and craft beer nerds for a long time now, and while we do occasionally have our differences, one thing it seems we all share is a love of learning and trying new things, as well as saving a couple of bucks. Well, right now, Craft Beer and Brewing is helping fans of Brewlosophy learn more while saving some coin by offering 20% off the price of a subscription to their awesome magazine. Chock full of brewing insights, tips, and recipes from industry experts, Craft Beer and Brewing is seriously great. I read every issue page to page myself. To get 20% off your subscription, all you have to do is sign up at beerandbrewing.com/brewlosophy. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the exGEERitor, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERitor.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order.
Just as the Grainfather all-in-one brewing system revolutionized all grain brewing at home, the Grainfather conical fermenter and glycol chiller take this one step further by giving homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation, just like commercial breweries use. With a full array of features including insulated double-walled construction, an innovative dual-valve yeast dump and sampling tap, and an integrated heating element and temperature controller, the conical fermenter provides a professional quality fermenting environment for superior temperature control. With the ability to individually power and control the temperature of up to 4 Grainfather conical fermenters, each with their own fermenting schedule, the Grainfather Glycol Chiller is the perfect addition to ensure superior fermenting results. And for a limited time, you can save 10% on your order by going to Grainfather.com and entering coupon code NZB during checkout. Once again, enter coupon code NZB when you order the Grainfather conical fermenter or Glycol Chiller Grainfather at grainfather.com. Once again, that's grainfather.com.
Up until maybe 2 years ago or so, my rather strong belief was that oxidation of beer was something that occurred really slowly. And the fact most of the beers that I was making turned out, at least in my opinion, and the opinion of my family and closest friends, was at least good enough. And that only served to confirm this belief of mine. Then Hazy IPA, or New England IPA, came around. Now, before we get to the various methods we've used, perhaps we could chat a little bit about what exactly cold-side oxidation is.
So in my mind, when we talk about cold-side oxidation, the beer doesn't actually have to be cold, but it is cooler than it has been. And there's kind of like that intermediary phase where fermentation happens, that the beer is cooler, but we don't really worry as much about oxygen because yeast will scavenge and use oxygen during the fermentation process. So we're talking about once fermentation is complete, what sorts of things can happen to the beer when it becomes oxidized, or when I don't want to say oxidized, but when oxygen comes in contact with the beer. And that's our focus for this show and our primary concern of oxygen in the brewing process.
Yeah, this idea. One of the things that I remember, we're fairly young, but even in the early days of brewlosophy, one of the questions that I would get all the time, even when I wasn't a huge adherent to this whole fear of oxidation on the cold side, was how come oxygen is so bad for beer when it's done fermenting, but we pump a whole bunch of it into wort before we pitch our yeast or right after pitching yeast.
Right. Well, the yeast need oxygen to replicate. And so that's why a lot of people making bigger beers will they will oxygenate.
Right.
There's a difference in the words. One sounds nasty and one doesn't. They will oxygenate their worts to help those yeast replicate for a larger, healthier fermentation.
Yeah.
When you go to the cold side, oxygen reacts with everything. It reacts with ethanol. It reacts with the hops. It reacts with, I can't never pronounce this right, acetaldehyde.
Acetaldehyde, yes.
We'll just call it the ahyde. So it reacts with ahyde. It reacts with the stuff in the hops. And what was the other one? It can also react with the true material as well.
Yeah, that's one of the there's a lot of theories out there about what exactly it is that causes. We know that oxygen, reacts with stuff. There's no arguing that. I don't think anybody would re-argue that. And that, and when that reaction occurs, it's going to, when it comes to food and when it comes to beer and other beverages, that oxygen is going to have an impact, or eventually at some point down the line may very well change the way that the characteristics of whatever it is you're consuming. One of the theories that I thought was the most interesting when it comes to oxidation of New England IPA in particular, because I do think, and I don't want this whole show to be focused just on hazy IPA, but
thank goodness.
Oh, you would love that, Brian.
No, I wouldn't. I'm burnt out.
You burnt out. Okay, that's good to hear. So you join the rest of the crew then. But it did really open up the door to us exploring more deeply the impact of cold-side oxidation. One of the things that I recall in the very early days talking with Scott Janish about, whose book on I believe the book is focused primarily on hazy IPA, just came out, just dropped. But one of the things that we were talking about that he proposed to me was the relatively high manganese content, which is a heavy metal, in flaked oats.
Yeah, I think he goes into detail in his book about it. No spoilers here, but saying that there is a reaction there that causes a more rapid oxidation of New England IPA. It would be interesting. I don't know what the content of manganese in wheat is, but I have seen other pictures of people that have brewed New England IPAs, and they've had quick oxidation effects or poor oxidation effects as well. So
yeah.
I think there's a lot of things going on And I think New England IPA just seems to be a little more sensitive to that.
It is. It's a very sensitive style of beer. And so,
what are you drinking right now, Marshall?
I am drinking a New England IPA that I made. I know I make fun of it because it's fun to make fun of, but I'm not a hater. I'm okay with whatever style people want to drink except milkshake IPA. I am drinking a New England IPA right now. I felt like it was only fitting. Plus, we're recording in the afternoon, which makes it more, I guess, appropriate. Yeah. But one of the things about manganese that, as I was starting to research that idea and talking to Scott about it, was a lot. Okay, one of the most annoying things about New England IPA, and I think a reason it got under a lot of people's skin, the people who are a little bit more, I guess, hardcore about beer styles and the way they should look, is when somebody would post a photo on social media somewhere of a popular canned beer, very vibrant can styling that was gray or purple or brown, when it wasn't intended to look that way. And I think a big thing with manganese, or at least what I read, is that when when oxygen comes into contact with it, it does have a tendency to kind of turn purple, I guess. A purplish hue, and I've seen that. That's something that we have tested out. You can look for it over at brewlosophy.com. But I don't know if that's because of manganese or if it's because of some other thing that's going on with New England IPA. I've also noticed the same thing in other beers, usually those that are hopped more highly. I had a beer that I took out of the keg. I took out of the Keyser, there was maybe a gallon left, and I just needed to replace it with something else. And I think it was a Helles, and I let it sit in my garage for middle of summer for maybe a month and a half before I remembered that it was still dirty. And when I took it to clean it, the beer on the inside had that same kind of purpley gray hue.
Yeah, I found most of the kegs that I let sit out and forget about or clean later or those sorts of things, they do have kind of a dark, murky brown. I haven't had so much of the purple, but they definitely shift their color.
Yeah.
As well as their flavor. I think there's a lot of different things going on. I mean, we've got the A-hide, we've got cheesy flavors, you've got the vinegar.
People say cardboard with it.
Sherry-like.
Yeah, sherry-like.
I think is another one.
And maybe all of those kind of play into the way I experience it. And this goes for any style, whether it's hazy IPA or Pilsner. When it is truly oxidized, the way I can tell, the way my palate kind of detects oxidation, is that it tastes like the sugary part, not the fruity part, but the sugary part of a hard candy. That very sickly sweet kind of sticks to my tongue experience of a hard candy.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially, again, on the hazier IPA styles. I tend to get a little more of like the kind of like a grassy, soapy, gritty flavor, I guess, almost.
Yeah.
So those are some of the effects of oxidation. There's lots of documentation out there, and you can read about all the different reactions.
Yeah.
But those are the big ones, kind of the vinegar, the cheesiness, the stale cardboard, wet cardboard, those sorts of things.
Right.
So we've got a bunch of different ways that we've discussed on how to prevent this.
Yeah, and
good news for you.
Good news for those who want to learn how to prevent cold-side oxidation. Now, there aren't a ton of ways to reduce cold-side oxidation without implementing some certain things that make the entire brew process maybe a tad more complicated and a little bit more expensive. Most of the methods that we talk about do involve extra equipment, but I think for the most part, you can get away with kind of jury-rigging some neat things to help with that. So I think the first thing we should talk about, there's kind of two main aspects when it comes to cold-side oxidation of beer. One of them is the oxidation that can occur in the fermenter, and then the other one is oxidation that can occur at and or in the package. I know that there's a lot of carryover there, but I figured we'd kind of try to organize it in that way. So the first idea that I've got, and this is something that Jake practices a lot, is one of the first kind of vectors of cold-side oxidation for a lot of homebrewers is when they start cold crashing their beer.
Right. That's when you get oxygen sucked back. There's there's with the temperature change, there's a gas volume change, and so if to keep that equilibrium pressure, gas comes back in. That can be through an airlock, through a blow off tube, whatever you want. People have experienced solution going back into their beer that they don't want as they've done this their first time, and I do the same thing. I think that you're about to mention that Jake does is I skip cold crashing.
Yeah.
I don't cold crash in the fermenter. I have done it a couple times, but I found that cold crashing in the keg has worked just fine for me.
Yeah. Well, and so for people who are making these really highly dry hopped beers, whether it's a West Coast IPA or a hazy New England IPA, one of the issues that people will run into is, well, there's going to be all that hop material, especially if you're using pellet hops. They break down into those tiny little particles. All of that stuff's still going to be in solution. So, what can we do to avoid sucking that stuff up when we're racking that beer over to the keg? One of the things that I've started doing, and I believe, Brian, you're doing it as well. I know you did the experiment on it, is dry hopping in those stainless steel canisters.
Right. If you have the ability, now again, this is a different equipment, or I guess if you're using a bucket, you have the same lid, but you do need to have a wide mouth lid. And I've been using canisters to prevent the amount of hop material. Now that's primarily because when I do a closed transfer, the hop material clogs up the keg post. I've made plenty of, my first 15 batches of hazy beers, and all my IPAs before that were always free range hops in the fermenter.
Yeah.
And what I find is that if I'm going to skip cold crashing, what I'll do is I give those hops just a couple extra days sitting there to let everything just fall out of solution or float or what have you.
Yeah.
And I make sure that it's in the location that I'm going to transfer it from. I don't, agitate it. And I just completely skip that step. I've can probably count the number of times on my hand that I've cold crashed in the fermenter.
Yeah. Well, I've, there's one of I mentioned the stainless sleeves. Those work great. The reason I like those is because you can pack a pretty good amount of hops in there. And because of its kind of linear shape, they're pretty long. I think 13 or 14 inches long or so.
Very long.
In my mind, more of those hops contact the beer. I've never had an issue with dry hops in the dry hop. I don't know if that made any sense, but people talk about finding pockets of like dry hop pellets when they dry hop too tightly in a bag or whatever. But you can use a bag. I guess you could if you're gonna throw in the hops freely. If you have a fermentation vessel that has a dip tube of some sort, perhaps what you could do is twist that dip tube up so that it's high enough above the tube line so that when those hops eventually do kind of settle out, at least you're not going to be racking it. You're not going to be clogging your dip tube or anything like that.
Right. And for a lot of people, they're still using siphons. So you can select, and I use siphons for all of my carboy fermentation. So, but that goes into the kind of the next thing is the other option is to ferment in a closed vessel.
Yep, exactly.
Something that you can pinch off.
Good Lord. Hey, well, and in terms of fermenting in kegs or a closed vessel of some sort, the beauty of fermenting, all I'm thinking of at this point is a keg, but I know that there's a whole bunch of new fermentation vessels out there that allow you to close off. The Flex Plus from Spike, the thing that I referred to earlier, that thing holds up to 15 psi of gas. So it's really easy to ferment in that. However, if you're fermenting in kegs, they are the exact size that you're going to be putting in your keys or later. So you can do all your cold crashing and everything, and then very easily use pressure to transfer that beer over to another purged keg.
Right. So it's a very easy solution for people that already have kegs. It does make a little bit more of a mess in the keg, would say is the only downside, but you're probably washing them out anyways. So why not? And I guess the other thing would be is you're going to end up with a smaller amount of beer.
That's what I was going to say. Our contributor, Matt Del Fiacco, he is probably, I believe he might be the only one who really regularly ferments in kegs. And when his recipes are usually about 4 gallons instead of 5. But if you're brewing all grain and you're brewing often enough, what's a gallon of beer?
Exactly.
So another little tip, and this one doesn't necessarily have to do with just the fermentation vessel, but a place that people often kind of glance over when they're considering vectors of oxidation to already fermented beer is when they're going in to take hydrometer samples.
Yeah, I've stopped taking hydrometer samples, and I've told myself no more sampling sour beers because even the smallest amount of sampling I've found can change a beer. I've had beers that taste great, and I'd sample them, and then 6 months to a year later, they taste totally different. So I don't take hydrometer samples unless it's on a really big beer, would be my only confession, just because in my experience, big beers can tolerate a little more oxidation better.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Than smaller beers, but otherwise, I haven't had a stuck fermentation on a regular sized beer in ever. So, I'll take that hydrometer sample to confirm it at the end. But we've shown examples where tasters can't identify the difference in a couple points, anyways. Yeah. So, if I'm a couple points off, I don't really care.
Yeah.
So.
I still like to know. I'm a nerd when it comes to numbers. I still like to know what my FG is and whatnot. But I am with you, Jake, and I think the rest of the guys.
I'm Brian.
Yeah, you're so right, Brian. But the what I was going to say is that I usually what I'm doing is I do still cold crash, and we're going to talk about the method that I use here in a minute. But I won't take a hydrometer sample until the beer is already being kegged. The idea being that I'm just confirming that final gravity was reached. But I know my system so well, and I've used every yeast out there so often. That maybe this sounds a little bit arrogant, but I just know when the beer's done, if that makes sense. And so if perchance I were to keg up a beer, and when I take that hydrometer and it's not an experiment beer or whatever, I take that hydrometer sample and it's way higher than I thought. Well, that's the point where I know something else is up, something else is wrong, because that's not normal.
No, it's definitely not normal to be like that. But yeah, I still take the data. I just do it after everything's already done. Yeah. So stop sampling for those of you that are having oxidation problems.
If you are having oxidation problems, it's impossible to eliminate getting a bit of oxygen into your beer if you're taking hydrometer samples, especially if you're using like a Thief or like I do, a turkey baster, or like I used to do. So yeah, you can just hold off on those. You don't need to know right away what your FG is.
And tying back into, I think the next one we're going to talk about, tying back into the fermenting in the kegs and unit tank and other similar styles, is to ferment under pressure.
Yeah. The interesting thing about fermenting under pressure to me is that there's a lot of other stuff, purportedly good stuff, that comes with fermenting beer under pressure. I should say, despite all of the evidence that we've put out there, all of the experiments that we've done on warm ferment for lager yeasts, apparently something about pressure makes it okay. And so that's one of the benefits, but also you're completely avoiding, if you ferment under pressure, not only are you completely avoiding any oxygen exposure, but you can use the pressure that you're fermenting under to eventually pressure transfer the beer out of the vessel into a serving keg. The one way to do this is to use a spunding valve, and in doing so, what you're essentially doing is allowing up to, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, I think it's 15 psi or so of back pressure to build up in the vessel that you're fermenting, and you can actually use that pressure to push the beer out of that vessel into another serving vessel.
Right, and a spunding will do that.
Exactly. So I'm thinking about, and there's a lot more than just this. I've seen a lot of, like, the SS has their Chronicle, which I know has a whole million different little ports and all that. But I've been messing around with this new Flex Plus from Spike, and I'm telling you, there's this weird thing that they sent me. It's got like 3 inputs. One of them's for a valve. One of them's a PRV that has it automatically relieves pressure at 15 psi, and then the other one is a ball lock, gas ball lock disconnect or post. And so what I've been doing is when I'll rack the beer into there, or the wort into there, I'll pitch my yeast, throw it in the firm chamber, and then what happens is as the fermentation from the fermenting beer starts to build up, the valve will eventually take over and blow off the extra CO2. Then you can reuse that CO2 for other things.
Right. I was just thinking of the person fermenting in kegs doing this, and I just wanted to throw out the disclaimer that if you are going to be doing this in kegs, you'll hit I think it's 60 or 80 psi before the pressure valve on a keg top will pop. So,
right. Yeah. No. You got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You definitely
Don't want
have to.
somebody, feedback next week. So my garage is gone.
Yeah, my wife divorced me. No, you definitely want to make sure to mind the pressure is a serious thing when it comes to fermentation. So, all right, this is probably my favorite tip here, which is sort of and I've got two different. We're going to talk about three different ways to kind of do this thing. But the tip is to capture and reuse the CO2 that's generated naturally. This is sort of what came up in our feedback earlier this week. So about a year and a half or so ago, I was messing around with New England IPA, and I did an experiment that did show that by reducing cold-side oxidation, the beer does ultimately end up tasting better for longer. That got me thinking about ways that we can really cheaply and easily, reduce cold-side oxidation, but by not having to go out and buy a whole bunch of stuff for it. And what I came up with, this is actually an idea that Ray and I were talking about probably 4 or 5 years ago, was to fill up a Mylar balloon with the CO2 that is naturally produced during fermentation. And that way, not only could you cold crash, but then using a CO2 from a tank, you could fill up the balloon again and put that on your fermentation vessel during kegging. So basically, the idea with that, we call it the balloon lock. All you have to do is go to your dollar store, your local dollar store. The best place to buy birthday balloons, by the way. My wife taught me this. You go and you buy the biggest balloon they got, and then find some sort of something that it's like I use a metal rod, a hollowed out metal rod. It's actually an old dip tube that I stopped using with my SS Brewtech brew bucket. I took that. And then you have to pull out, there's this weird, it won't let you, there's a weird thing in Mylar balloons these days. You have to kind of cut that thing out. And then I just used some masking tape to really tightly secure the end of that Mylar balloon onto the end of this dip tube. So that was nice and tight. And then the other end just goes into a stopper that fits into whatever your fermentation vessel is. And as the beer ferments, the balloon fills up. It's very festive. The problem is, unless you have some way to relieve the extra pressure, it will eventually pop off of your fermentation vessel. So what I started doing was, after about 3 or 4 days of fermentation, then I would go and I'd pop on. People say, well, how do you know that there's no oxygen in there? I don't know, but I squeeze out as much air as I possibly can before connecting it to the fermentation vessel, and then it more slowly fills up kind of towards the end of fermentation. And I just trust that that's mostly CO2. And then when it's done fermenting, when I skip taking the hydrometer sample, I'll just go and reduce the temperature of the chamber down to about 32 degrees, and that's 0 degrees Celsius. And it sucks in probably, I'd say, if it's a full balloon, I would say it sucks in maybe a quarter to roughly a third of the CO2 that's in the balloon. And then at kegging, you take your fermentation vessel out. I always keg into purged kegs. We're going to talk about how to do that and methods for that later. But what I'll do is you got that gas in the balloon, so I'll start the kegging process. And now everybody knows you don't keg with an airlock on because it'll suck all of that airlock juice back down into your beer. Now it's sucking CO2 down into the beer. So this idea that there's a blanket of CO2 above your beer the entire time, gases mix very readily. So I don't trust that idea. Now you don't have any O2. It's just CO2 above your beer. Then what happens is this is kind of the downside. The CO2 runs out. So then what I'll do is I'll take a small plastic cup or even just a piece of foil, and I'll cover the hole very gently. I'll turn off the valve on the bottom of my fermentation vessel. I'll cover the hole with the hope that no O2 gets in there. And then I'll fill up the balloon with CO2 from a gas tank or from a CO2 tank. Put it back on, repeat the process. Only have to do it once, and you're kegging basically O2-less beer.
That is quite the process.
It sounds complicated, but it's actually really easy.
I've tried it out. It worked. Well, I don't know if it worked, but I definitely got a lot more than one balloon's worth when I was cold crashing. I was also a little paranoid, so I did fill it up again, and then similar to the way that you're talking about. We'll talk about this when we're packaging a little more. But I just at that point, I don't use the balloon when I'm transferring. I remove that and hook it up to the gas.
Yeah, that's another way to do it. We'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah.
The Balloon Lock idea truly is like how cheap and easy can you make this whole process without ruining beer?
You have to use the Mylar balloons. I remember back a long time ago when I started brewing, people were talking about putting like latex balloons over the top of their stuff, and they'd put like a pinhole inside of it so it would like inflate, but it would not pop, and they would use that. Those are quite permeable, which is why at the end of your party they're all deflated. So make sure that you get a Mylar balloon. Those things, they'll hold helium for I think over a week.
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry as much about them. But yeah, that's one way to do it. I believe there's another device on the market that does something similar.
Yeah, there's a few actually. So prior to me. I'm going to put this in quotes, but developing the Balloon Lock idea. I was actually the folks from NorCal Brewing Solutions up in Northern California. They reached out to me and had a really nifty little thing that they'd built called they call a CO2 capture device or something like that. But basically, it's two large mason jars that you. As the CO2 is coming out of your tank, it's going into one mason jar that has water in it. It pushes that water out using pressure into another mason jar. And then that second mason jar basically acts as your typical blow-off vessel. And it's pretty neat. It works really well. It's not going to let any O2 back in. And then when you cold crash, it sucks that CO2 back in from the first mason jar, and then it'll start sucking the water back in to the first mason jar as well. And at that point, you're not going to get any the tube coming in from the keg is so short that it won't suck up any of the water. So it works well. I used it a few times. It was just kind of cumbersome, but go check it out. It's kind of a neat product. Another cool one, I forget what they call it, but Bobby from Brew Hardware invented or worked on, kind of built this neat bladder system. It works a lot like the Balloon Lock. It's very cheap, but the problem, what's cool about it actually, is that it has that PRV. So once it gets full, you don't have to worry about it popping off of your fermentation vessel. Have you seen these, Brian?
I've seen a picture of them. They do look a lot like a fancy Balloon Lock, but my personal just easy mode method is to skip cold crashing is what I do.
Yeah, and that's the thing is when it comes to reducing cold-side oxidation in the fermenter, most of it is occurring during the cold crashing process, presumably. And so, those were some simple ways that we came up with to reduce cold-side oxidation. When we come back from the short break, we're going to be talking about a few more methods when it comes to packaging to reduce cold-side oxidation. We'll be right back. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Hi, I'm Stephen Leash, creator of Brow Supply Brewing Systems, here to tell you about our latest Unibrow brewing system. Modeled after the brew in a bag method, the Unibrow uses the same kettle for both mashing and boiling, replacing the fabric bag with a stainless basket that can hold up to 20 pounds of grain. A heating element is run by an electric controller that allows for the maintenance of specific mash temperatures and makes mashing easier than ever. Each Unibrow is shipped with a counterflow chiller and the parts required to brew a batch of beer. We're really proud of the Unibrow, and we know you'll love it as much as we do. Go check it out at browsupply.com and sign up for our email list to receive special deals in your inbox.
Homebrewers are a clever lot and always seem to be coming up with neat new solutions to common problems, including reducing cold-side oxidation. The methods we've already discussed were primarily focused on reducing oxygen ingress into the fermenter, but in order to really be safe, and arguably, this is the biggest vector for oxidation, it's important to ensure the serving vessel is purged of oxygen as well. Now, a very commonly accepted idea when I started kegging was that by gently filling a keg or even a bottling bucket from the bottom to the top, and you kind of go slow, that CO2 in the beer would be expressed and essentially create this blanket that pushes the oxygen out of the vessel. This may be true to some degree. I believed it for a while, but my experience and the results of some experiments would suggest that it may not be the greatest solution to reducing cold-side oxidation. Perhaps the most popular method of purging a vessel involves using CO2 from a tank.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people started with the same idea that you did, with the idea that you're pushing it out from the bottom. The same people, and I'm guilty of doing this way back in the day, or thinking this, is that, you know, there is sort of this magical blanket that sits on top of your beer for an extended period of time, or at least for a little while.
Yeah.
But gases mix, and they do mix rather quickly. And so when you anytime that you purge a keg, I mean, you can try and, I guess if you have it on really high PSI, you can try and flush out as much as you can. But really, you know, every time you do a purge, if you fill it up with you fill up a fair amount with carbon dioxide and then purge the valve, you're removing a certain percentage of this now carbon dioxide oxygen mix. And the more carbon dioxide that you introduce each time you do that, you know, you're reducing it by whatever that amount is. And it depends how much you put in. If you were to, you know, put in half carbon dioxide, half oxygen the first time, you're at 50-50. The second time, you're at 75 or 60-33. How does that work?
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Maths are hard.
Lost my math. But, you know, the idea is you're just reducing that mix to being a lot less than it was. The only real way to do it is to fill that up with a liquid, preferably Star San, or something else that has been sanitized, and then push it all out completely with carbon dioxide. And there's two sources, one of which we've mentioned earlier, for doing that. The first one obviously is to do it with the tank. You know, and if you do it with a very low pressure, it takes a long time, but you don't use as much gas, and you can do it very quickly with the high pressure. But it does take all of the carbon dioxide or all of the liquid out and replaces it with what's in your tank, which is carbon dioxide.
Yeah, this is something that I was very hesitant to jump on board with. When I first started kegging, the common wisdom at the time, God, this was 6 or 7 years ago now, maybe a little bit longer. The whole idea was, first off, cold-side oxidation. I'm sure it was talked about heavily in some groups, particularly professional brewing groups. But the homebrewers that I know, I mean, we were just putting a tube at the bottom of our keg and gently racking, you know, from our fermentation vessel over to the keg. And then what we would do though, and what we thought was like good practice basically, is that you blast that headspace of the keg with 15 PSI of gas, you take it off, you purge it, you do it again, you do it 6-7 times. And I believe Ray still does this, you know, and swears by it, that it works fairly well. And I can see the argument for that. It really wasn't until my experience experimenting with cold-side oxidation that I started universally purging all of my kegs in the way that you talked about. I just take Star San solution or whatever sanitizing solution you prefer, fill up my keg with it all the way to the top, and then I push that out. I've got this keg full of gas, and then I rack, with pressure, like we talked about in the last segment, I'll rack that beer over to this now freshly purged keg. Seems to be working really, really well for me. The biggest downside is that you're wasting money on gas and to purge that keg. I spend for a 10-pound tank, I think I spend like $21. So
Right, and I think the lower pressure you go, I had a buddy of mine go through, we debated this back and forth, and we did the math on how much gas you actually save. And I want to say you save like 1/10 of the gas by using only a few PSI to do it. So if you're really, somebody that plans ahead, which not everybody is, you could, set it up in the morning and go ahead and keg it up in the afternoon, or, you could have it push from one to the next, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
and
that's what I do.
Flush out a ton at once.
I think I do mine at between 3 and 5 PSI. It's kind of hard that, they don't, it's hard to read those gauges when they're that low, but it's been working really well for me. The coolest thing, and this is something I only recently started doing, this goes back to the feedback that we got earlier in this show, is purging your keg with gas that's naturally created during fermentation. To me, this is a game changer because I basically have to fill up my gas tanks just from carbonating beer and pushing the beer out of the kegs. So what I do now, again, I've got the Flex Plus. This is that, really nice, got all kinds of features on it that allow for you to do this, but you can easily do this kind of stuff with other types of fermentation vessels, like our feedback. You can do it with glass. You can do it with plastic carboys. You can do it with a keg. You just got to think through this and make sure that you're doing it right. So what I do is I connect, in essence, there's a connector on the top of the Flex Plus, but what you're doing is rather than going into a blow off or into an airlock, you're connecting some sort of a tube that will go down into the liquid post of the gas post of a keg that's full of star sand. And then you've got that liquid post connected to what I do is another keg, because then it's easy. Now I have another keg full of good star sand. But you can have it go into a bucket or something that's large enough to contain the 5 gallons of star sand that's in your keg. And then as fermentation kicks up, as long as your fermentation vessel is fully sealed, it's going to create pressure, and that gas is going to push out all of that star sands. I say slowly, but it actually it happens pretty quickly. It'll push all of that out into whatever vessel the tube coming out of your liquid post is connected to. I'm telling you, this works amazing. I did a Belgian double that fermented really strongly, and within the first 8 hours or so, I had an empty keg full of CO2. I just kept it connected because why not? And that second keg that I had, that star sand got pushed into, just served as my basically my blow off bucket. It was a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it seems like an easy way to get a bunch of CO2 in a bunch of kegs.
Yeah, piece of cake. I've heard from a few people who started doing this, and everyone that I have heard from has absolutely loves the fact that they're not wasting money on store-bought CO2, but kind of relying on. And there's an argument to be made. I don't know how serious it is, but that the whatever flavor might be in that.
That was
CO2,
my next question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing though, is I haven't noticed an issue with it. And yes, CO2 that is being produced in a hoppy IPA, maybe it will impart a little bit of that character into a really mellow Helles or something like that. But I haven't noticed anything yet. And I've done it, I think I've done the last 4 or 5 batches that I've made. So I don't plan to go back to using, another method. I absolutely love this method. Yeah,
it sounds like a great one. And if I had the ability to put 8 more extra kegs in my fermentation chamber, I would totally try that out too. It makes me, I wonder if you could just drill one hole in this. Yeah, I don't know. I'll figure out a manifold system for purging all my kegs when I'm fermenting.
Yeah. It's the hard part is now if you're using something like let's say you're using the SS Brewtech brew bucket, you can actually go and buy a basically this thing that connects, it creates a post instead of the hole that's in the top of the bucket and top of the lid. And that post you can connect and it will hold a seal up to, I believe it's 1 PSI. So you got to be careful with that, but it doesn't take that much to push the star sand out of one keg and into another one. So
yeah, I think we did the math on that. It was about 1 PSI. I've just used a stopper and jammed something with a barb in it, and that's how I push the CO2 in. But you could use it for removing CO2 as well.
Yeah, whatever works. Give it a shot. But that's what I'm using nowadays. So when it comes to purging kegs, you can use again store-bought. You can use naturally produced CO2. Both work awesomely. If you're going to use natural, just be careful. Because again, pressure can hurt you. Another very easy way to avoid cold-side oxidation on the packaging side is just to serve from the vessel that you fermented it in. We've already talked about this before, but it hits on both points. If you're fermenting in a vessel that has that, or you're serving from the vessel that has the beer fermented in it, there's no way you're going to get oxygen in there. Easiest way probably. However, the issue there is, in addition to, you're fermenting less beer generally, so that because of the blow off and whatnot, usually, fermentation creates trub. And so you're going to have to figure out a way to deal with serving the beer from atop that trub layer. I think the most common way is to just cut off about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of the liquid dip tube.
Yeah, I've heard similar things. I've never actually done that just because the amount of substance and particulate that there is, trub, dry hop matter, it just doesn't appeal to me, because despite my I don't know if I'd say love, but my enjoyment of the hazier beer style, I don't enjoy a yeast starter or things with dry hop material or flavor crystals or whatever you want to call it. I've heard people in groups call those hop particulates that fall to the bottom flavor crystals, and they happen in more than just New England IPAs. Just bottles that have sat around for a while and then suddenly got stirred up, where there's a lot of flocculation in the bottom. But
salad in a glass, man. You know what I mean?
What?
Salad in a glass.
Salad in a glass. Yeah. And that's actually one thing. It kind of goes back to our previous discussion, but that's one thing we didn't really talk about too much, is dry hopping and reducing oxidation, because that's something that happens on the cold side. You and I have talked about this in other shows, and the idea of creating the brew airlock, or something that you can flush it out. But the best way, just to summarize, I think the best way we've described introducing dry hop material into a beer that is undergoing or has fermented out is to do it while it's undergoing fermentation.
Yeah.
You've mentioned doing it at the beginning of fermentation and having good results. I've mentioned doing it, most of the way through fermentation. We've kind of talked a little bit about biotransformation and our current, I want to say, disbelief in it.
Yeah.
Or just lack of
evidence.
Evidence. So that is one. That's probably, in all of these methods, the only point at which you do introduce oxygen, and at the homebrew level, I don't know of any way, other than hoping that it gets scrubbed out during the final part of fermentation, to introduce dry hops without oxidizing them or wrecking them in some other way. If you filled up a keg with dry hops and star sand and then push your star sand out, sort of thing.
Yeah. Even on the professional scale, I have a lot of friends who brew professionally. It's the same struggle, right? Because they're opening a manhole at the top of these fermentation vessels and adding buckets of dry hops. What do you do to avoid oxidizing that beer or potentially oxidizing that beer? I don't care if I'm making a New England IPA or if I'm making a classic crystal clear, really delicious, slightly bitter West Coast IPA. I am adding the dry hop charge when fermentation is still occurring, usually 24 to 48 hours into fermentation. I'm not doing the whole, adding it at yeast pitch thing much anymore. Only I don't know why I don't do that, but my thinking on that is, first off, the biotransformation argument, which we can talk about that later. I'm not entirely sure it works, but I do think that a big part of the reason that the people who are making good examples of hazy IPA, I think a big part of that is because they're minding cold-side oxidation, and one of the techniques that they use is by adding the dry hops during fermentation, when the yeast is still going to metabolize the oxygen that is introduced.
Right. So that's. I just wanted to touch back real quick when we were talking about serving from the vessel, because that is the only completely closed-off system unless you are going to be dry hopping.
Exactly. Now, I know we've been leaving out people who bottle their beers. This is a very difficult
people.
It's a very difficult discussion to have when it comes to bottling. We're going to get to that in just a minute. I promise. We're going to do our best to talk about that. But the first or the last idea that I want to talk about is this very unique one when it comes to reducing cold side oxidation on the packaging side. is to use antioxidants. These are chemicals that are known to I don't really know what they do to oxygen. They scrub the oxygen from the beer or whatever it may be.
Yeah, so the popular one that you see a lot is sodium metabisulfite. Potassium metabisulfite is also a popular one.
Also known as Campton. Yeah.
Campton tablets.
Yeah.
And it releases sulfur dioxide when it's added to the beer, which is a strong reducing agent that initiates a redox reaction. And so it can, the takeaway is that adding that can lead to lower levels of dissolved oxygen. You often see this in winemaking is one of the big ones.
Right. Yeah.
But it's been tossed around in certain communities that do use techniques that not all of us do. And they use it in almost every step of the process. But lately we've kind of been, the crew and some of the recent experience, we've been talking a little more about using sodium metabisulfite, or SMB as it's called,
right.
For those of you that are on the in different parts of the brewing process to see what it can do.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by this concept. I believe it was Jake who was recently talking about how he and it's not much. I mean, we're talking a minuscule amount into the keg, right?
It's about 30 to 50 parts per million.
Yeah.
You end up adding, I don't know. I've got my own solution of it mixed up, and I end up adding about 5 milliliters per gallon of this solution that I have that ends up, with about as much accuracy as I can do, about 30 to 50 parts.
So you're doing this fairly regularly nowadays.
So I've been doing it. A buddy of mine, the buddy that I brew with when I'm not brewing for Brewlosophy, we do a lot of big projects and barrel projects and cider and all that sort of stuff. And he's even more science minded than I am, and he's been using it for all of his ciders, and he uses it for all of his big beers or bottles of beer that he's going to age for an extended period of time. So I didn't see any adverse effect to using it, so I've been using it. And mine, I think I mentioned I filled a barrel the other day. I had dosed the barrel with that. I dosed the kegs with that now. So yeah, I've been playing around with it, and I just keep a little solution of it on hand, and I just replace that solution every now and then and it's actually kind of interesting because I've got it in a Nalgene that holds about 100 milliliters. Yeah. And you screw the top on and you let it sit for a while, and it actually kind of like. It's like when you come off the airplane, the pressures change. It shrinks in on itself because it's consuming that oxygen.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. Despite no change in temperature.
Right.
Yeah. Honestly, I've not messed around with it. I've got a full pound of sodium metabisulfite, the SMB. I use potassium metabisulfite for making cider to knock the yeast out. I believe I think most people view them as being fairly interchangeable for this purpose, right? As antioxidants. I don't know off the top of my head. I've only used potassium metabisulfite mixed with citric acid as a barrel preservative to make sure nothing grows, but I don't know whether it's a 1-to-1 or whatnot. Yeah, they're similar at the very least. It's the metabisulfite is the antioxidant, is my understanding. So definitely something to look into. I haven't messed around with it, but I think that it's a huge avenue for us to explore even more. We've done some experiments on it already. There's another product out there that I know people are using for various things, Brutan B, that it can get used early on in the process during the boil and whatnot. But my understanding is that also has some form of an antioxidant effect as well. Is that something you know anything about?
That's nothing I really know about. I ordered some of it. I threw it in a beer, and I was like, "Oh, the beer kind of turned pink," and I forgot all about it.
That's one of the things during the. I remember when I think it was Jake who did that experiment with Brutan B. The foam on the hot break was like bright pink. It was kind of interesting. But
no, I remember reading about it real quick, and it's like one of those things where if you don't think about it, it just leaves your brain.
Yeah, no, believe me, I've never even seen this stuff. It's kind of difficult to get, I guess, but that may be another form of antioxidant, or I just might be wrong. I don't know. I've had a few beers already, so. All right, now, just so we don't leave those of you out there who are bottling your beers out, we're going to talk about a method, and maybe we'll come up with some new ones for reducing cold-side oxidation when bottling. I'm going to disclaimer this. It is very difficult when you're bottling your beer to reduce cold-side oxidation. And without a little bit extra equipment, one of which is a keg.
Right. So the best way to do it is to actually use a keg. I mean, kegging in my mind is the best option that there is for packaging beer. But if you really, really, really want to put it in super fragile glass and store it someplace and dispose of something and wreck the earth later, one way to do it is to use a beer gun sort of device with a keg of beer, a tank of CO2, and a small rubber stopper on that beer gun.
Yeah.
And so you can use the beer guns usually have two triggers on them. One is for purging with carbon dioxide and one is for filling. A quick 10-second purge, and then you can fill it and cap it right away, right on the foam there. And that's what I've done for most of my bottling for competitions and sharing and what have you.
Yeah, and here's what sucks about that, and we're not going to pretend it doesn't. People who bottle condition or who want to bottle condition, who also want to reduce cold-side oxidation, a lot of them don't really. The reason they bottle condition is because they don't want to spend all the money on kegging equipment. But if you're using this method that we're talking about, which in essence what it involves is racking the beer from your fermentation vessel into a purged keg and then racking the beer out of that purged keg into purged bottles using a device that allows you to purge those bottles with CO2, like a beer gun. And unless you're purging that keg with naturally produced CO2, you've got to have a tank of gas to purge it with. You might as well just keg if you're going there. So there are some other things that we can talk about that are, I guess, purported to reduce cold side oxidation. I'm going to say up front that I've gotten probably 100 emails, if not more, from people who bottle condition New England IPA and all of the little tricks, one of which I'm just going to say it out right now. I don't think they work, are these oxygen absorbing caps. These beers turn out brown and taste like candy. And, so they're not working too well. And this isn't a diss on bottling. I think there's a lot of styles that work really well for bottle conditioning. But there are some techniques that we've heard about. You just got to be really, really cognizant of what's going on, where your beer is at in the fermentation process. Perhaps the most scary method, Brian, this is terrible advice. I'm not going to, this is not me recommending that people actually do this, but I've heard of people trying basically bottling beer at the tail end of fermentation. So they're trying to get it while there's still oxygen in solution, where there's still yeast in solution, so that yeast is still, using up any oxygen that might be in the bottle. Of course, the obvious downside is the potential for bottle bombs.
Right. If you don't know what that final gravity is going to be, you really are gambling. And I don't know exactly off the top of my head what the numbers are in terms of volumes of CO2 in relation to gravity points. But I can tell you that even with my amazing techniques, I still have some varying degrees of final gravity in beers, ranging from a point to a couple points between batches. So I don't know. It sounds scary. Nothing I would do. I'd just spun a keg.
But you have to have a keg, and that's the problem. We got a lot. We got a lot of shit about this article, which we'll link in the description of the show, because there were so few. In fact, there's just one really good ideas for ways to avoid cold side oxidation when bottling.
Right. I think the only ways to really do it, is the best way we described is coming off the keg, and the other way is to do bottle conditioning.
And bottle conditioning though, there's these, if you're bottling your beer, you're going to bottle condition, you're going to carbonate it via bottle conditioning. The problem is I don't know if the amount of fermentation that occurs in the bottle is enough to scrub all of the oxygen from solution. And based on the pictures that I've seen of hazy IPAs that turn gray, purple, brown, whatever color, I'm not sure that works too well. If anybody has any really good ideas for reducing cold side oxidation or eliminating cold side oxidation when bottle conditioning, let us know. I don't do that anymore, so maybe that's why I don't know. But it also just from a kind of a technical level seems like a really difficult prospect.
Agreed.
All right, we've got some reader comments on reducing cold-side oxidation. We did put this article out, and so we're going to go through some of those. We've got some good stuff here. The first one comes from John Edrick, I think, or Edrick. He says, carbon dioxide is 1/4 times heavier than oxygen. If oxygen gets pulled into the fermenter during a cold crash, it should just float on top of the carbon dioxide, which shouldn't affect the beer. So as long as you transfer carefully to a keg that's been well purged with carbon dioxide, there should be little oxygen in contact with the beer.
And I'm just going to quickly nip this one and just say that that's not how gases work.
Right.
It's not meant to be harsh, but gases, they mix, which is great for us as humans because otherwise we'd be sitting in a sea of nitrogen and we wouldn't be able to breathe. I mean, our atmosphere is mixed, and there's nothing really that says that a gas will float on top of another gas. They move around, they bump around. Those molecules are free to cruise around and do with what they will and fill the container that they're in quite equally. So, sorry, that's just not how it works. Our next comment comes from SM Schaff from the article. I'm not trying to snip John's idea. It's not what happened.
That's why
I'm sorry, John.
No, I included it because it is a very
I just didn't want to come across like a Richard or a dick. Sorry,
you are a jerk. But anyways, go ahead.
All right, so our next one comes from SM Schaff or Schaaf. In the article, he said, after transferring to the keg while minimizing oxygen exposure, couldn't you add DME to the beer to self-carbonate in the keg? The yeast activity during carbonation would consume any oxygen in solution. This goes back. You were just talking about this during bottling.
Yeah, actually, that's something we didn't really focus too much on, was natural conditioning in the keg as opposed to bottles. I think it's a good way to do that. But if you're already if you're going to rely on naturally produced CO2 to carbonate the beer, my suggestion, if you're using a keg which can hold, I believe they're safety tested to like 150 psi or something like that, you may as well just rack the beer over, when it's still got 2 Play-Doh to go, and then just let it carbonate that way. Put a spunding valve on there, and that way you don't have to add any DME or sugar or anything. To answer your question, SM, I do think you could get away with that. My biggest concern, same thing with bottle conditioning, would be, is the fermentation that's occurring enough to consume all of the oxygen that is present in that keg during the kegging process? So I don't know. I've naturally conditioned a few times. Most of the time that I've done it, in fact, I think every time I've naturally conditioned a beer in the keg, it's been a Saison. And I don't know how sensitive that style is to oxygen, but it did seem that the beers came out well. I don't know. Brian, maybe you have a different experience.
Nope, no experience. I've never done that before.
You've never naturally conditioned in a keg, really?
No, I don't see the point.
Okay,
it just makes a mess.
touche.
You just end up with more stuff that falls at the bottom of the keg.
Yeah, it's true. There's quite a bigger trube cake that results at the bottom of the keg.
I forgot though, the bubbles are smaller when you naturally carbonate.
Hardy har. All right, next comment comes from Jordan Folks, which, if you recall, last week this is the guy who brewed up the delicious Brute IPA. He says, as a fellow O2 reducing fanatic, I love this article. I've used the keg priming solution beer gun method to bottle several bottle conditioned beers, and it works great. One suggestion: to ensure mixing of the priming solution and beer after you've filled the keg with beer, attach the CO2 to the beer outpost and bubble CO2 up through the bottom. This effectively mixes the solution as well as giving it one last O2 scrubbing CO2 blast. My only issue with this one is that it still requires that you have basically all of the equipment for kegging in order to bottle. But yeah, it sounds like a good idea.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense to me. I think shaking the keg also works fairly well.
Yeah.
But that does actually, real quick before I forget, that does tie me back into we were talking about dry hopping, and I have heard of some professional breweries, they will bubble up carbon dioxide through the bottom of the beer as they're dry hopping. So if you were dry hopping into a container where you can do that, that might be an option for you. All right, Reddit user Mantis Toboggan MDF ACP. Oh, toboggan? Huh. He says this might sound odd. It did. But I found that a urinary drainage bag for use with catheters is a surprisingly elegant alternative to your Mylar bag technique. Yeah. elegant.
I don't know.
Yeah,
man.
I love it. It's basically a bag with a barb on one end and a release valve on the other end. I just learned a lot about urinating drainage bags.
Likewise.
They're sterile right out of the bag. That's cool. And the cone barb will fit a carboy hood or any drilled stopper. If the bag gets too inflated, just release some of that CO2 through the built-in release valve. I bought mine through Amazon. Urine jokes aside, that actually sounds pretty sweet.
It sounds badass, actually. I don't recall reading this comment when the article first came out, however long ago it did. And you better believe that I've got Amazon up on my computer right now. I think I'm going to pick up a couple of these things. It depends on how much they cost, but...
I bet you could get a used one on eBay.
Oh, my God. Anyways, there's too many jokes that could go with that. That's so gross. But, a urinary drainage bag, remember that and go Amazon, search Amazon for it because it does sound like a really cool solution. My only concern with that would be, how big those bags are because...
2,000 milliliters with a 48-inch drainage. You can get a 5-pack for $20.
Damn. I mean, this does sound like a pretty good deal. 2,000
or you can get
milliliters.
1,000. Yeah, let's
2,000
take the biggest.
milliliters. How much do you think a Mylar bag holds? I would think like 3,500 mils, something like that. Of gas.
Yeah. Well, here's one. Here's a 4,000 mil one. All right, let's get back to the comments.
It's a great recommendation.
It's a great idea. Yeah.
Mantis Toboggan MD FACIP. So the next comment comes from Reddit user Jamal H. Nguyen, who says, so basically what I'm getting from this is that as a person who is unfortunately limited to bottling right now, there is no good way to avoid oxidation that doesn't involve buying at least half of a kegging setup.
Boy, my response would be look into using some sodium metabisulfite.
That's the best I got too. Yeah.
That's that and just, actually there's nothing else. I would say that, you could try the oxygen absorbing caps, but, you maybe not sort of thing. Even if you can get one keg, just to do all of your bottling from, that might be a better start.
Yeah.
But I guess even then you're still looking at using carbon dioxide to be able to purge those bottles.
Yeah. Unless you have a friend who's willing to let you borrow 5 gallons of carbon dioxide in a keg every time you bottle. This sucks because it really isn't. Now here's the thing. There are styles that do seem more sensitive to oxidation. Hazy IPA, in my opinion. I've made award-winning beers that come out really well that I took no effort to reducing cold-side oxidation, with the exception of all the simple stuff, right? This does not mean that you're guaranteed bad beer. I don't think I've had a New England IPA. Somebody shared it with me because of how oxidized it was. That was bottle conditioned, and it was horrendous. I mean, I don't know what to say. Maybe there are people out there, and I'm sure we'll hear from you, who are making New England IPAs in bottle conditioning, and they're coming out great. And I'm not talking about 2 days after you bottle it. I'm talking, once it's nicely carbonated and whatnot. If that's the case, let us know. And if you have the tips and tricks, I'm beyond interested. But yeah, Jamal, I honestly don't know if there's anything else that can be done. Yeah, to reduce that.
Yeah, and I don't want this to sound like we're hating on bottling or anything like that. It is, one of the more mundane tasks I think in the process. But when I was brewing all of my series of New England IPAs, I didn't use any of these crazy techniques. I mean, I had a siphon in a carboy, and I was just put it into a keg, filled it up, purged the top a couple times, and purple beer. Yeah. So it doesn't happen with every batch, but I do feel like it's possible you could be taking a gamble, and that I'm just speculating. If you're bottling, you probably might have a smaller setup or not quite as much stuff, not producing as much beer. So you lose a batch is a bigger, sadder event. So, all right, our final comment comes from Reddit user Restless Chicken. Restless Chicken says, I pushed Star San a few times to purge kegs before packaging, but I became concerned that I was leaving a lot of Star San in the keg to dilute my beer, and now I just fill the keg with CO2 and purge a few times. I didn't try to rock the keg or anything to lessen that. Have you checked how much Star San on average you leave in there?
I'm the nerd who has checked how much liquid my dip tubes in every keg pulls out. Check this out. all of it, with the exception of some bubbles and maybe a couple of drops just from the surface being wet still. My dip tubes go right to the bottom of the center of the keg for the most part and pull all of that liquid out. So I'm not worried about it. A buddy of mine accidentally racked 4.5 gallons of beer into a keg that still had half gallon of Star San in it, and it tasted like normal beer. So I would never want to do that, but it did reduce my worry about having a couple of drops of Star San solution still, in the keg. So that's what I'm doing.
Right, and if your dip tube doesn't go to the bottom of your keg, all kegs are special and unique in their own ways, and they don't always purge quite as much out.
Right.
You can take the keg and flip it over, and then pull on that PRV valve at the top, and that's actually the lowest point of the top of the keg when you have it inverted. And so anything residual there will come out through the top of that release.
Of course, if you are a Pinlock keg user like me, you can't
keg loser.
Keg loser. Well, yeah, I put that on myself, but you can't do that with Pinlock unless you buy the special caps that do have the PRV. But that is good. But yeah, Restless Chicken. If it's working for you, it works for you. I've never tried that, so maybe you are getting rid of enough oxygen so that it doesn't matter. But so that again, and this is what we always boil things down to. If it's working for you, if you're making beer that you like, whether it's New England IPA that looks muddy or not, and you're cool with it, then just keep making it and enjoying it. That's really what matters the most. So, well, Brian, that brings us to the end of our first episode, our first exBEERience episode. I had fun doing this. I'd really like to know what our listeners think about it. So please do leave us feedback. Brian, what'd you think?
I thought it was great. I love the format. I think it's fun just having a conversational conversation, and I had a very good experience. God, I just can't stop with this.
It's so cheesy. It's so cheesy.
It's really cheesy. Yeah. No, I thought it was really good. It's fun to be able to talk about multiple different experiments and experiences that we have had in a format that kind of all come into this one topic and provide some recommendations, but of course it's all recommendations. Use at your own risk. Yeah. It's what's worked for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the kind of the inspiration for this is that we often get asked, and by often I mean all the freaking time, how have we changed our ways because of the experiments? So while we're not focusing on specific experiments per se, we are talking about the stuff that we're doing now. Hopefully it was interesting to you. And I look forward to doing more of these shows as well as some of the stuff from the other series we talked about in the beginning. All right. Well, that is the end of this episode. Be sure to head over to brewlosophy.com to read up on the topic discussed in this show, as well as everything else we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.